Well, thank you very much, Mindy. I'm the late Joe Biden. I just want you to know, as much as I love you, I've been in a meeting with the president on another matter for the last 2 hours, and it's hard to say, Mr. President, you're on your own. I'm leaving. Although he is on his own, he doesn't need me. But I came first and foremost to say thank you. And by the way, you are the indispensable partner, not government. You are. Businesses, corporate America is, our banking industry, our financial sector is, and I mean this sincerely. You all, absent your judgment that we have to act to have a sustainable energy source, we're not going to get anywhere. We're not going to get anywhere at all. If you notice, until you all started to come on board, this was a very, very steep hill to climb. I use an expression all the time the president continues to joke with me about, because I have a tendency to quote my father and mother frequently. But the phrase he's reminded me I've used probably in the last 7 years over 100 times in our meetings is reality has a way of intruding. Reality has a way of intruding. And, imagine the jobs that, and you do, but for the public to imagine the jobs that we can create, imagine the savings for consumers and taxpayers we can generate. Imagine the fewer cases of premature deaths and heart attacks and childhood asthma. And imagine the idea that I may still be able to, my grandchildren and great-grandchildren may be able to still go down to Rehoboth Beach and it be anywhere near where it is now. And I'm not being facetious when I raise those issues. You know, the administration's climate action plan outlines how we can go about curbing pollution, ushering in a clean energy economy, making sure we lead the world, and we have to lead the world in tackling the most consequential issue of our time, climate change. And that's why we hosted this summer, to show that as we head to Paris, we are really close to a historic deal. Our most iconic businesses are stepping up at the time that's occurring. You know, as we announced earlier, now 81 companies have signed the American Business Act on Climate Pledge to address climate change and support a strong agreement in Paris. And by the way, I didn't host, but I spoke at the first such meeting. I think we had something like 16 companies that were here. It just keeps multiplying. You know, important companies operating in all 50 states, employing more than 9 million people. You all generate more than $3 trillion in annual revenue. Iconic brands like Coca-Cola, Facebook, Hershey, Johnson & Johnson, Kellogg's, Levi Strauss & Company, McDonald's, Nike, Starbucks, Target. I could go on, and I apologize for not mentioning some of your companies. But heading to Paris, we're showing the world that we have three assets that will allow us to seize this moment. One is we have a consensus among the American people, not the American political system, but the American people. And I'm not being facetious when I say that. And by the way, I think, given their druthers, the vast majority of our Republican friends know we're right. They really know. It's not a matter of. There was a phrase used by a presidential candidate when I was a young kid saying, "In your heart, you know I'm right." Well, in their heart, they know that there's gravity and climate change. Being a little facetious, but when you think about it, it's like denying gravity. But at any rate, but it's being denied for political reasons. And the denial is not a luxury for those of us responsible for governing and representing the best interests of our country. And that's why you all are so important, by the way, because a lot of the very interest groups that oppose, and by the way, we'd be lying to one another if we didn't acknowledge there's winners and losers as we make this transition. There are. We try to accommodate for that in our suggestions. For example, coal, there's a whole group of hard-working, decent, honorable people who build an entire culture for the last 150 years around coal. It's not just It's not just the salary. It's not just the coal mine. It's how you get married, how you get buried, what your social mores are, what churches you go to. I come from Scranton, Pennsylvania, long since no longer a coal center. But there is an ethic about it. So it's not, so those of my liberal friends who just dismiss this notion that, well, it's just the way transitions occur, there are people who get hurt. There will be industries that get hurt. There are, and it matters. It matters. And we have an obligation to help them transition. But the bottom line here is that you're so important because you are the very source of the economic growth that a lot of our Republican friends is the one area we still have agreement among most Democrats and most Republicans, that you all matter. You matter to the growth of the country. You matter to employment. You matter. You know, the second thing that's going on here is my friend Ernie Moniz has discussed. We have the most advanced scientific and technological skills in the world, and we are able to innovate and address these problems. And we already are innovated, amazing the reduction in costs, which I'll speak to a moment, in solar energy and wind and making it more competitive with coal. There's just so much out there. I spend an awful lot of time with Dr. Holdren's group because I think we have so many amazing opportunities we're just on the cusp of, from in the healthcare industry to the climate to imagine, by the way, what we could do if, I've been the leading guy on, and as a consequence, very controversial, on gun safety. The last time we passed any legislation dealing with guns was what I wrote. I wrote the proposals for the president. The American public agrees, but we're divided. We're divided badly. But imagine the technological capability that's within our grasp if we were to make a moonshot to say that we're going to develop a capacity that you could only pull the trigger of a gun that had your DNA, your fingerprint, that no one else could use that gun. You'd have no Second Amendment problems because no one's right to own a gun would be, in fact, impinged on, and it's within our power. We can do it now. It just costs hundreds and thousands of dollars. But it's within our power. There's so many things out there. But the most important area is in the area of climate. And we have so much available to us if we make the proper investments. The third thing, we have an economic system that is ready to accommodate the shift to clean energy. Last year, and is anyone from Goldman Sachs here? Last year, I spoke at Goldman Sachs North America Energy Conference, and I asked the question, and there were a group about twice the number of you guys, and I asked the question. I said, "What's the long play? What's the energy future here?" To state the obvious, I'm not an investment banker, otherwise I wouldn't be listed as the poorest man in the Congress. Nothing I'm proud of. I'm not proud of it. When I got sworn in as vice president of the Washington Post, as my wife is a professor, so you can Google it, said, "It's probable no man has assumed the office of vice president with fewer assets than Joe Biden." I assume they were talking financial assets, but all kidding aside, but I told the audience of bankers and investors that I wouldn't go long on investments that lead to carbon pollution. I'd be betting on clean energy, and all of you have agreed. You're making a business judgment. You're not just making a moral judgment, a sound judgment for your children and grandchildren. You have stockholders you're responsible for. You're making a sound business judgment here. Companies are already pricing in the cost of carbon into business decisions. Many of you here, Google has started to price it a while ago at $30 a ton. Disney, $10 to $20 a ton. Procter & Gamble, its entire manufacturing base is going to wind power, which will reduce enormous amounts of CO2 emissions. But again, it gets down to the bottom line. What do you bet on long? Where do you go long here? And the thing that, again, I'm more excited about, I had a chance to speak to the solar industry and all those interested in it down in Southern California just a couple weeks ago. There were over 1,000 people there, and then I keynoted the U.S.-China meeting in L.A. hosted by the mayor. They were all good folks there, but they don't excite me as much as all of you because they already are in the deal. They're already in the deal, and they're in the deal because they have a financial interest, but also because they think it's a moral and a practical imperative we deal with climate change. But again, don't underestimate your power. Your power to make the case to the community at large that makes economic sense for your company and your stockholders to make the decisions you've made. The case that climate change is not just an environmental issue, it's a moral issue, but it's also a national security issue. We don't talk about it enough. It's economic. It has the reality of, as I said, reality has a way of intruding. It's just hanging out there. In 1986, when I introduced the first Global Climate Protection Act, and just think about it, it's called the Global Climate Protection Act. No one had ever introduced in the Congress something to deal with climate change. It was the first piece of legislation in the Senate to limit global warming. And at that time, I pointed out that reality has a way of intruding. I just happen to have a very, very bright young man who was deeply involved in these issues, his name was Mike McCabe, a brilliant guy. He was the assistant over at number 2 guy for a while at EPA after he left me. But everybody it was the biggest yawner in the world. No one wanted to pay much attention. Understand, it's not, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying I'm prescient or anything. I just happen to be concerned about this issue for a long time, since I ran as a kid in 1972 for the Senate. It made me very popular in the state of DuPont to talk about the environment as the biggest issue. And DuPont's been a good citizen. But, reality has intruded. And since I introduced that legislation, we have 19 of the hottest years have occurred in the last 2 decades, hottest years in history. Last year was the hottest year on record around the world. And we're on track to break that record again this year. We're reaping the consequences of inaction. In California, the most severe drought in 1,200 years is getting worse, not better. In South Carolina, we've gotten more rain than they've ever received on record since 1880. It's not a question of if, it's a question of when we see superstorms like Sandy that will cause death and destruction and billions of dollars in loss. And as the Pentagon tells us, this is a national security issue. The Pentagon wrote a paper, it's now about 7 years old, saying that climate change is the threat multiplier. It will cause more wars. Those of you who are familiar with Darfur and all the carnage that occurred, that's about climate change. It's 2 peoples in 1 country fighting over arable land. It's consequential, and it will get worse. Imagine if the sea level rises even another foot, how many millions of people will be displaced, particularly in Southeast Asia. Imagine what will happen. You think the migration patterns coming out of Afghanistan and Syria are a problem now. You want to destabilize existing governments. Watch what happens when tens of millions of people and food security is at stake and they are on the march. This is not Joe Biden. This is not some, quote, good government green guy out there, tying ribbons around oak trees. It's a simple proposition. This is the United States military, and they're already beginning to plan strategically the allocation of billions of dollars worth of assets in order to protect America's national interest. Look what happens in the Arctic. Access through the Arctic to U.S. waters in ways we've never contemplated before. This is gigantic. So we have a choice. As my friend, the President and Science Advisor, John Holdren, who always is uplifting, I'm sure he was with you. He didn't scare the hell out of you, I'm sure. He used the phrase, he said, we can mitigate, we can adapt, or for lack of adaptation and mitigation, we can suffer. Think about the new standard we use now, and we talk about the consequences of natural disasters. We no longer talk about, in terms of the aid we give to localities of the federal government that are in deep trouble, we no longer talk about building back to what was the circumstance before the storm. Can't do that anymore. We have to build back to a new standard, a much higher standard that anticipates the reality of the repetition of the very kind of superstorm or storm that caused the problem the last time. It's a hell of a lot more costly, but it's also recognition of the need to adapt. This is a deadly serious issue, and we have a deadly serious way to approach it. And that's what we've done since day one in this administration. In the Recovery Act, which I had the happy obligation of being able to administer, it was over $800 billion, and no one, it was said, I remember, you won't remember, when the president introduced it in the joint session, when he was announcing his budget, he said, and Joe will do it. Remember that commercial, like, Mikey will eat it, Joe will do it, Sheriff Joe, okay? Well, it was destined to be an absolute failure because everybody knew the government can't administer almost $1 trillion program and spend $1 trillion in 18 months and make it work. But the interesting thing is that every outside and inside study shows less than 0.2% of the $832 billion spent resulted in waste or fraud. Darrell Issa, not a Republican friend of mine, he's a friend. I don't consider Republicans enemies, they're friends. But even Darrell Issa has said, this is the way every government program should be administered. Not a joke. But the point was, in that process, we invested $90 billion in clean energy technology, the largest clean energy investment in history. Because we believe that although the government is not the answer, government can kickstart this. Government can bring a lot of money off the sidelines if it invests. For every dollar we invested in that act as related to infrastructure, $14 came off the sidelines. And that's government's role. It gets back to you. It's back to what you are encouraged to do if you believe there's a national consensus to move. It's done big things for solar and wind. The cost has been driven down, making it competitive with the dirtiest forms of energy, the burning of coal. Since we came to office, the cost of energy has been reduced by more than 60%. Now, some of it's not all as a consequence of us. There's a whole lot having to do, it's not Obama and Biden, there's a whole lot having to do with the access to significantly more gas and oil as a consequence of fracking and other means. So I'm not suggesting, but in terms of the clean energy side, now, clean energy, and in terms of solar energy, it's now at an all-time low. When we took office, it cost 15.1 cents per kilowatt hour for solar energy. It's now 5.9 cents per kilowatt hour because we said we're invested, we're in the deal. That encouraged, and because we had tax credits to move it. And we pull people off the sidelines. And all the significant intellectual capacity your companies possess got in the game with the Department of Energy. And with our Sunshot initiative, we're working to reduce the cost of solar, which I announced on behalf of the administration about 2 months ago, or maybe a little less. We think we can reduce the cost of solar energy by 2020 by another 75%. And that's why we announced last month a $102 million program to get more companies and businesses and research universities working toward that goal. We've increased electric generation from solar 20-fold. It's now the fastest growing source of energy, enough to provide clean and reliable electricity for 4.6 million American homes. That's not nearly enough, but it's a hell of a lot more from where we were in the beginning. And one of the benefits of solar is that the industry is, some of you know, is creating jobs 10 times faster than the rest of the economy. Solar jobs have grown by 86% since we took office, now 174,000. That's more people that work in good paying jobs, by the way, not minimum wage jobs. And that's more people than work at Google, Apple, Twitter, Facebook combined. And I'm not suggesting they're not critical companies, they are. But in terms of employment, it's real. And it's expected by the end of the year there'll be 210,000 jobs. And the industry pumps nearly $18 billion a year into the economy. We triple electricity from wind, enough to power 16 million homes. Supports over 50,000 jobs. And if we make the right decisions, it could reach, the outside estimates are, it could reach 600,000 good paying jobs by 2050. We now generate wind power at 2.35 cents per kilowatt hour, cheaper than coal. We've instituted the Clean Power Plan, cutting emissions of our power sector, which make up a third of the U.S. carbon emissions. We're cutting emissions by 32% by 2030. I predict it will be even larger as technology and science outpace what is expected. The largest step the United States has ever taken to combat climate change. And we know that we can't move the energy future with the outdated policy of the past for over a century. Look, the reason we have tax expenditures is that we're trying to promote certain activities. And we have tax expenditures, meaning we don't collect a tax otherwise that would have been required to be paid, because we want to promote certain activities. And it makes sense. It makes sense. And over the century, we subsidized oil and gas companies to drill. It made sense because for every 10 or 20 wells sunk, you only came up with 1 or 2 gushers. It made a difference. And it was a rational thing to do. But today, can anybody argue that the oil and gas industry needs nearly a $5 billion a year tax credit? If you just took half of that, we could cover all the cost of renewable energy tax credits, and the rest could be used to reduce the deficit or let them have half of that as a tax credit. What are we doing? What are we doing? And by the way, I'm not one of these guys, you know, let's go after the rich and the powerful and they're the problem. They're not a problem. But everybody has to do their part, man. There's got to be some rationality to this process. So in every budget proposal since we took office, we've called for eliminating the fossil fuel subsidy. But our friends up on the Hill, even though some of the testimony from the industry itself said we don't need it, our friends insist on continuing it. And instead, talk about, you know, the idea that climate change is not real. Well, they show it. They don't think it's real because our friends in the other team passed budget that slashed the Energy Department's renewable energy budget by 40%. That's their proposal. The answer is to slash the existing research and development efforts by 40% at the Department of Energy, precisely at a time when we should be doing more research and engaging in more research and development. But here we are. We're doing the exact opposite that we should do. We need more investment, not less investment. And it'd be different if our critics could point and say, well, the investment you made has, over the last 7 years, has not produced anything. It really hasn't altered anything. I remember in the beginning of the administration making a speech in the Recovery Act saying this will drive down considerably the cost of renewable energy. And it was, there he goes again. That's a fanciful notion. Well, you know, as my friend Alan Simpson, the former senator from Wyoming, Republican, a great guy and a great friend, he said everybody's entitled to their own opinion. They're not entitled to their own facts. And so, these severe cuts are exactly the wrong approach we should be taking right now. We should be investing more in research and development. And look, where we are is that this is a worldwide problem, and American leadership is vital. One thing I agree with our critics about is that, and the president does as well, that America has to lead. We always hear this about in foreign policy, we have to lead. And we do have to lead. Usually it's in the context of every problem is a problem that is directed at us. Half the time we're not the target of whatever's going on. But we have to lead, and the place we can lead the best is, there's a phrase that I've been using for some time that often gets quoted, is that we have to lead not just by the example of our power, but by the power of our example. It's amazing why the rest of the world repairs to us as much as they do and looks to us for leadership. It's the power of our example. And that's exactly what the president has done in using the bully pulpit of the presidency, making the case more clearly. And granted, we have an advantage because things have gotten worse. Isn't that a bizarre thing to say? Things have gotten worse, so we get people's attention more rapidly. That's why President Xi and President Obama agreed to reduce carbon emissions in the world's two largest economies. No one thought President Xi would sign on to that. A 26 to 28% reduction in the U.S. below 2005 levels by 2025, and China will peak its emissions around 2030. We've learned a lot of lessons from Kyoto and Copenhagen. I have to admit, I've been around for both, and we have learned a lot. And we're determined. We are determined, and we're encouraged that other countries are stepping up to the commitments that they are making to go to Paris. And they require elements that we can read whether or not they're really going to keep their commitments. Number one, they're making commitments that are transparent, that have accountability built in, and that ratchet up targets over time. In Paris, we have to we have to focus on the financial and technical support for low carbon development. Some countries are going to need assistance in this area, and it is in our overwhelming interest. If they cannot afford the transition, we, the major companies, the major countries, should be engaged. The agreement has to be durable and dynamic enough to adapt as the world begins to change and the economy begins to grow. But we're not going to be able to do this without two things. One, we have to start at home. We can do all the preaching about the problem around the world. If the president is not able to deliver the United States and us do our part in an ambitious way, then it doesn't matter much. We need ambitious goals to reduce carbon emissions here in the United States. Again, that's where you all come in. And two, we have to have a public-private partnerships as well as city-state-nation partnerships. And that's why we're working with China to help create those partnerships at all levels. Last month, as I said, I spoke out in LA to the U.S.-China Climate Leaders Summit in California, a wordy title. But what it did, it brought together the major municipalities in China, as well as major municipalities in the United States. Two of the participants in China, cities, generate more carbon output than Japan as an entire nation does, than Australia as an entire nation. Just two cities that participated. And the good news is that they are, speaking of reality intruding, there's two things even oligarchies, dictatorships, or less than democratic nations have to worry about. One is corruption, because even their most ardent supporters don't like their money being stolen. And two is people dying because they can't breathe or the water isn't pure. I really mean this. So what you've seen in China is these cities are setting more ambitious goals than even their government is setting. their federal government, their national government. It's the one place where the national government in China has allowed cities to move beyond what the national goal is that's been set. And so we brought them all together. And we brought along provincial leaders of both countries to build partners. We brought in governors and mayors here in the United States. Because there's a lot of places in the United States that the governors, California always is an example, are prepared to go beyond what the national standard is. And prepared to say we can do more and demonstrate more can be done. Setting a standard. Los Angeles and Beijing, for example, are working together on low-carbon urban planning, research projects, technology exchanges. It's real. I mean, you know, when's the last time any of you have been in Beijing? You've been there in the last year? Raise your hand. You probably wore a mask somewhere along the line. Not a joke. Not a joke. I'm not being critical. It's just a fact. There's an overwhelming interest in doing something about it. And guess what? There's an overwhelming business interest for us as well as the moral imperative. Technology we develop, we can sell. At the front end, we can give some of it. In case you haven't noticed, remember when that typhoon knocked out Japanese nuclear industry for a while? And, you know, we used to always say to people in the United States, you know, what happens in China matters. They're building one new coal plant a month, and it's going to affect us. And people go, oh, yeah, you know, we'd always have the non-climate guys say, no, that doesn't happen. And then all of a sudden, a cement barge bigger than this room rolls up on the beach in Oregon. Well, if it can float a whole cement barge, people all of a sudden went, whoa, it matters what's happening in Asia in terms of the air I breathe. It matters what's happening in Asia in terms of my physical health. And so there is, but this, look, what we need this everywhere. City leaders working with federal and state governments. We need governments working with the private sector and nonprofits and the academic community. I see that happening here at EPA in terms of stormwater drainage and sewers and et cetera that impact on where you decide to place your companies. I noticed 100 years ago when I was a local official, when you decide to put a plant or facility in another community, beyond the tax break you may look for, what else do you look for? Is there a railhead? Is there enough water? Do I have access to a highway? Do I have a workforce capacity that is able to meet my needs? These are things that happen that are just driven by the reality. One of those realities, and it is a real reality, is the long-term impact of climate change. Look, you're letting a secret out in a way that I can't, no matter how many speeches I make, no matter how many places I go, and that is that clean energy is the long play. Clean energy is a long play. Number one, it starts a virtuous cycle. It'll replace more good-paying jobs than will be lost. It will, in fact, fundamentally alter the environment in which people want to do business. It will fundamentally change the way in which we calculate everything in terms of cost of doing business. And what you're doing, and I'll end where I began, and I'm not being solicitous, is more important than anything the government can do ultimately. The free enterprise system is the vehicle that has made this country. It is the thing from which we grow. And we have the greatest, most agile venture capitalists in the world to allocate capital as well. And you're making just sound decisions that happen to have a profound moral and a profound economic impact on this country. So the real reality that's now intruding is you. You have more impact on the nature of this debate going forward over the next 5 to 10 years than any other part of the economy. You. And I can't thank you enough for stepping up. It's always good. I used to have a friend named Lawton Chiles. Remember Lawton Chiles? He was a senator from Florida. I got here in 1972, I was 29 years old, and Lawton had gotten elected in 70 by walking the length and then the width of his state. And his nickname was Walkin' Lawton. And he was one of the most insightful political minds that I knew. And I had been there about 5 months, and I sat next to him because I was very junior in the back row. And there was a little amendment that passed, and he really was excited about it. And I turned to him thinking, well, I don't fully understand the system yet. I didn't know what was so impressive about that amendment. I said, Lawton, what am I missing here? He said, Joe, with his southern accent, he said, Joe, he said, what I'm cheering for, he said, it's amazing when conscience and convenience cross paths in public life. Well, if Lawton were here, he'd talk about this as conscience and convenience. It makes overwhelming sense to do what you're doing, and I can't thank you enough for recognizing it as rapidly as you have. And hopefully, the next time we have this meeting, we'll have to have another room. I mean this sincerely, we'll continue to double the number of major corporations in America that are making clear to those voices that know better, but in fact are saying the wrong things, that it's overwhelming their interests as well, because it's good for business, it's good for the public health, it's good for jobs, it's good across the board. So I thank you for your commitment, and with that, I'll get out of your hair. Thank you very, very much.